Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you to Jason. Great presentation. I've really been looking forward to the opportunity to come and really drive a good discussion today around sales operations. And really it drives off of what you heard Jason just talk about, which is the importance of research. So for anyone that is not familiar with Serious Decisions, we are a research and advisory firm, and we work with sales, marketing, and product leaders within B2B organizations, and we help them understand key best practices that really become elements of implementation in their business to help accelerate growth. And we drive that through very particular services that are role-based. One of those services in particular is around sales operations. And so through that research that we've built, we continue to see through the interactions in our clients that sales operations is trying to fill this void. They're kind of bridging that gap that says, hey, we have these incredible technical capabilities, but we have to become a much more strategic function. And why is that? It's because sales leaders are asking sales operations to do that. They need them to be more strategic in their business to help drive growth and be successful. Unfortunately, what we see is there's a lot of external forces out there that are constantly changing within the environment in which we work within. And because of that, it really disrupts the way sales operations is trying to function. And we start to see that sales operations starts to become a little ill-defined. It doesn't know its path. We get very reactive. We can't be proactive. And without that ability to evolve, we're not going to be able to deliver that strategic need that we're being asked to do, or really makes us a best practice operations function. So what I want to be able to do today is talk to you a little bit about what's really driving this need for sales operations to adapt and change and really start to think about the ways in which they can be much more strategic. I'm also going to give you some insight to what we have defined through our research as critical accountabilities that sales operations must have in order to be successful. And more importantly, what are the competencies that we want to bring into our organization as leaders to ensure that we can execute against those. So drivers of change, they're all around us. They happen every day. These are just a handful of ones that we continue to hear going on in sales organizations today. So we think about what's going on with our buyers. More digital activity. Right? We did a buyer study and we actually saw that buyers are spending just as much time in digital activities, learning about and interacting with your organization as they are in human-to-human interactions. So that's a big change, but what you heard in there is just as much time as they are with human-to-human interaction. It's a change, but it's not a takeaway that sales isn't there to support anymore. We look at what's happening from an analytics and a big data perspective, constantly being bombarded. What are you doing with your data? How much do you have? Is it the right data? What is it telling you? How do we start to analyze it? What can we provide as information out into the sales organization? Customer experience. Now, in my practitioner days before I became an analyst, I spent a lot of time helping sales reps understand how to get to that signed contract and then see how quickly I could get them back out there selling again. In today's SaaS cloud environments, that's not the case. The sales rep has to be there to drive good customer experience. There's a lot of change going on right now in multi-generation, both on the seller side and on the buyer side. How do our managers start to be able to understand that better? And when we look at the change in the relationship between sales operations and IT, we start to better understand that sales operations has become a business owner of the sales stack. Certainly IT is involved, but we become decision makers. Now that change is certainly driving stronger investments within sales operations. So as I said, we're a research and advisory firm. We spend time with thousands of B2B organizations understanding what they're doing, how they're doing it, applying that to best practices. What you see here is right from our database. So I've broken the data out into 3 revenue bands. And what this demonstrates is average size of the sales organization in each of those revenue bands. And the percentage of investment that you see in sales operations is a percentage of investment compared to revenue. This has been increasing over the last handful of years. You also see the percentage of headcount that sales operation makes up within a sales organization, also increasing. So we know the investment is there. Sales operations is getting the attention. It's being seen as strategic, but we have to be able to get ourselves to that point where we can deliver upon that. And the way that works is looking at what are those major accountabilities that we have as a function, and what are the competencies that we need to apply against those. So I want to ground us so that we kind of can relate to each other throughout this conversation. And I'm going to do that through helping you kind of understand how we look at those 2 pieces. What does an accountability mean? What does competency mean? So as we build our research and we look at accountabilities, we talk about it between 2 components. It's the capabilities and the responsibilities that exist within the function. What are those? How are they defined? Can you put those into a singular category? From a competency perspective, there's 4 critical components. Knowledge. What knowledge must I have in the role that I'm performing within my function? Skills. What are the critical skills that I must either have or acquire in order to do my job? Process. What are those process pieces? And then finally, the tools and technologies. Do I know how to implement them? Do I know how to use them? Can I take full advantage of them? So what I'm going to talk about as we go through the majority of our conversation is looking at how we use accountabilities and the competencies that map to them to bridge that gap that I started the conversation off on. Now, I want to do that from the standpoint of using it through the voice of a sales operations leader. So we did some primary research where we actually went out and surveyed and talked to sales operations leaders in B2B organizations. And what you see here is the representation of the mix to which we're able to reach out through our client and through some non-clients to be able to really understand. So a nice distribution across different revenue sizes and across multiple industries. So this isn't just for a high-tech company or just for an insurance company. This is what we see within B2B. So I'm going to use that information to help drive some data points as we go through each of the key accountabilities and we talk about the competencies related to them. So through this research, we've actually seen there are 7 primary accountabilities for sales operations. Strategy and planning, sales intelligence, process design and management, support and administration, deal pursuit, technology, and project management. And we're going to take each of these one by one. I'm going to map out for you those competencies. And we're going to look at those competencies in 3 areas: basic, intermediate, and advanced. And then I'm going to pull just a couple of core pieces out that really kind of leaped out in our research that kind of enlightened me to what's going on in sales operations functions today. So let's take the first one, strategy and planning. Right, perfect timing for that. Many sales organizations right now are either in the midst of their planning process, finishing their planning process, maybe you're about to kick off your planning process. But it's where we start to develop the strategy. And if sales operations is not integrated into that process and helping to understand what's the go-to-market strategy, what does our budget look like, how are we going to develop territories, what are we going to do from a compensation standpoint, we are missing an opportunity to bring insight into that process that's really critical. Now, in particular, what we see over and over again in a lot of organizations is really around the focus of territory design and compensation as a critical piece. Why? It's something that sales operations has great insight to and has the competencies or should have the competencies to be able to execute on. So as we go into the data, it was interesting. We asked within our survey 3 critical things about these accountabilities. We wanted to understand, so how highly engaged are you within your organization around that? How would you rank the competencies within your organization? And what's the level of importance of that? So as we looked at strategy and planning, what we actually saw is overwhelmingly, sales operations leaders said, hey, I have great competencies across my function when it comes to strategy and planning. It exists. I've got the right people with the skills and knowledge. But less than half of those organizations actually execute upon that. And as we dug into it, it's because they're not being engaged into the process. It's being looked as a leadership element. We don't see sales ops taking that strategic play inside of that. And a perfect way to demonstrate that is to give you a little bit of a use case from a client that I have. So this was a software company, been around for over 30 years, just over $250 million company. And they were heading into their sales planning process, and they came to serious decisions, and they asked for our help because they really wanted to understand, hey, how can we do this better? It hasn't worked well past years. And really what was challenging for them was that territory design was very decentralized. Each sales unit kind of did it on their own. There was no consistency in the process, and they were missing their opportunity to cover key areas in the marketplace where they saw growth. So as we worked with them, we started to help them pull sales operations into this process and really help them understand the way in which you could put consistency into territory design. So we gave them a set of call to actions that I hand to you that says, hey, as you look at this, start to align on a formal planning process, end to end. That starts with what are the strategic goals that we're starting to develop in our business, all the way through to execution and evolution. Your plan does not finish at the end of the planning cycle. It needs to evolve. It needs to look at the changes in your business. And initiate that through a very systematic territory design, and ultimately apply compensation against that from the standpoint of, and we talk about this all the time, compensation sets expectations. If you're sitting there today and you think about compensation as purely a reward mechanism for your sales organization, it's not going to work. If you're quickly jumping to compensation and saying, if I pay them enough, they're going to do what I need, it's not going to work. You have to have the plan in place, and you have to align your compensation plan against the key expectations in that plan. So the second one is around sales intelligence. As we think about sales intelligence, this is everything to do with analytics, data management, reporting. And the word intelligence is so critical in this conversation. That's the expectation that the sales organization has around those areas. Intelligence, not insight. And when we think about this area, reporting continually comes up. How we do it, what we report on, who we're reporting that information towards, and is it providing the output that they need? So what sales operations leaders were telling us is that we're executing, right? I was actually kind of shocked. 62% said that we're regularly executing reporting. I hate to see what those other organizations are doing if they're not reporting, right? Should be 100%. But the interesting correlation to this was, yes, we're executing, but only 28% said we have high competencies. This tells me that sales operations functions are basically taking the information they have, they're putting it in a report, and they're hitting the send button. They're not applying analysis. They're not looking at it and saying, hey, is this going to help the audience that I'm sending this out to? The challenges that are driving this within sales organizations today, and in particular for sales operations, is that end users' kind of needs and requirements are increasing every single day. It's why we see that tactical reactive mode going on. It's what happens when you start to give information out. Sales managers say, hey, this is great. By the way, I want to look at my business now this way. No, this way. Now this way, right? We're constantly trying to, oh, yeah, wait, I'll come over here. I'll create the report in a different lens, right? So that reactive mode doesn't help us to step back and say, wait, what should we be reporting on? I see very low performance around data strategy, data management. Not looking at the data and saying, it's great that we have a lot, but what is it that we really need? And is it valid? And who needs that information? At the same time, it's a very manual process. I have a large client base that uses Salesforce as their platform of choice. They also use Excel as their reporting platform of choice. Okay? I can't tell you how many times I'll have a client say, hey Mark, I can't take a Monday morning call with you because I'm up all Sunday night building the reports for Monday morning. Right? Manual process, killing productivity. The other side of it is the governance of that. They're creating them, they're sending them out, they have no idea how they're being used. Right? Those spreadsheets get into a manager's hand who takes them and says, well, let me put my flavor on it, let me turn it into my spreadsheet. Right? You lose that consistency. So what we want to be able to do is create audience profiles. Marketing does this all the time for our buyers. Right? They look at our audience and say, who are we selling to? Well, we have an internal audience as sales operations, the sales organization. Who are we creating information for? What intelligence do they need? Looking at the technical capabilities that exist within our sales application stack. How can we report? In what ways? Right? And putting a cadence in place. And what that means is just because we can report on things in real time does not mean we should all the time. What's important weekly? What's important monthly? What's important quarterly? And then apply that to our audience. This is where best practice sales operations functions start to go from, hey, I got lots of data, I'll run you lots of reports, to, no, wait, I want that report that helps me better understand my business. I want something that gives me knowledge as a sales manager or a sales rep. Process design and management. Right, you just saw Jason talk a lot about the sales process. Extremely critical. This is actually talking about things in the plural. There's certainly the sales process, and I'm going to dig into that a little bit, but what about things like the lead management process that drives into the sales process? What about the quoting process? What about the contract process? Pricing approvals. There's all of these tangent and interlocked processes that come into play, and sales operations has to be able to kind of look at that big picture. Now, foundationally, yes, it starts with that sales process, and yes, it has to be buyer aligned. And many times, organizations are not doing that. I did some recent polling with some sales operations leaders, and I asked them about their sales process, and I said, how many of you are still running what I would define as an activity-based sales process? Basically, it says there's a bunch of steps, and at each step, I list a number of activities that a sales rep should do. Right? 67% said that's what they're managing today. Not buyer aligned, not defining key attributes that say, here's the knowledge inflection points for the buyer. If you apply those, here's the observable outcomes. Here's the key assets you need to use as a sales rep, along with those activities. So it's not just, here's the buyer's process, here's the sales process, the stages line up, you're good to go. No, there's a key set of attributes in between that you have to be able to define. So let's go back to our sales operations leaders and dig into what was going on from a sales process standpoint. Shocking to me, 55%, oh, it's highly important. Are you kidding? That's it? Why would only 55% say that a foundational, buyer-aligned, defined attribute process is important? Because it's not being executed. It's being put into the business. And we go like this. Hopefully sales reps are going to follow it. I hope they're building opportunities in the pipeline the right way. They're not actually seeing it executed fully. Another client case for you. Yes, this number is correct. Manufacturing company over 100 years old. Pretty successful, I would say. Over $1 billion in revenue. Here's the challenge. No process government. Did they have a sales process? Of course they did. Everyone was using it differently. They weren't really able to understand whether or not the organization was following through in a very consistent way across that process. And because of that, as we went out and started interacting with the sales organization, reps were telling us, as well as them, I don't see value in it. It's not helping me. It's not a guiding tool for me to understand how to better engage my buyer. So we said, hey, you know what? You need a mapping initiative. So we brought some insight from a research perspective to the sales operations function and said, you need to understand what's going on with the different processes in your business, how that starts to relate to the way in which sales reps interact with your buyers. And it's about productivity. If your sales process is not viewed by the reps within your organization as helping them to be more productive, you need to take a step back and relook at it, because that's what it's about. How do you get them as productive as possible? Is it giving them the guidance they need to be able to sell more? And is it aligned to that buyer's lens? Does it define out what's going to happen, and can I clearly observe that so that when I go back and look at that opportunity, there is no question that I am guiding and working and moving that buyer forward in an aligned way. And one of the last pieces that's so critical is getting your managers involved with this, right? Even with those percentages that I showed earlier on about the size of sales ops function across multiple organizations, even an organization that's fairly large, we can't be in every conversation with every sales rep. We have to get our managers to be able to be evangelists. They have to talk through that process. They have to manage to it. They have to believe in it. They have to use it as a guiding tool when they're coaching with their reps. It's so critical. It's an extension of your ability to have that process be valuable within the business. The next one is support and administration. And this is one that a lot of times sales ops leaders will say, oh, I know this one all too well, right? This is all my tactical stuff. We're going to unload everything from the sales organization into sales ops. This is all the back office stuff. Partially true, but there's more to it than that. Right? This is critical for looking at order process flow, pricing. This is where sales operations working with your product organization is critical. What does the roadmap look like? How are we going to put that out? Are there new offerings coming? Are we making modifications? How do we start to prepare the sales organization to be able to work through that? What are we doing from a contracting perspective? Right? Really important. One of the things that stands out, though, is a newer component, which is around contract lifecycle management, CLM. We're hearing this more and more coming up in organizations. How do we start to use the information that exists within the contracts that we're creating with our buyers as an intelligence point for sales reps to better understand their customers? And so we started kind of reaching out and saying, hey, what's going on in sales operations today? How many functions are really starting to look at this? And what we saw was that a lot of organizations were raising their hand, and I think this is part of that driver of why CLM is starting to kind of get more noise in the marketplace. They're saying, hey, this is important. 42% of sales ops leaders said, yeah, understanding what's going on from a contracting and a life cycle of that is really important to us. But at this point, not many engaged. Right? So why? Well, for the most part, in many organizations, that contracting work exists outside of the sales organization, not just sales operations. Right? It's usually with a contract admin function or the legal part of your organization. So there's really not that connection to the sales organization. It's kind of off-handled to the side. So there hasn't been that ability to say, well, wait a second, is there value to us bringing that insight back into the business? And for the most part, it's a manual process. And it's not to say that organizations aren't using electronic signatures and things of that nature. They certainly are. But again, many times, that's the only piece, right? Oh, I know, the contract was signed. The buyer signed. Great, the deal's closed. But all of the other information that's housed in there, volume pricing discounts, commitments of purchase size over a course of a year or 2 years, right? All of those kind of nuances that get built into contracts is not then connected back to the account for the sales rep to be able to use that as a valuable piece. So what I offer to you as sales operations leaders is the ability to look at that and say, there's information here that's valuable to sales. And in particular, it's about aligning with the function that exists in your business today that's managing, whether that's contract admin, legal, whatever it might be. How do you start to pull them in and have a conversation with them that says, you've got valuable information that I want to bring to the sales organization? And define a data strategy. It's not just about saying, let me rip everything out of that and add that to my database. What is it that we want out of those contracts? Because by the way, things like limited liability, probably really not important to a sales rep. Buying commitments, important. Right? Preset discounts, really important. So find those key data points and understand how to manage those, and really understand from a technology standpoint where you might have those capabilities today to be able to pull some of that information so you don't just launch into a manual process. Deal pursuit. Deal desks exist in businesses, a lot of different levels, whether that's for your complex deals, RFPs, whatever it might be, but there's more to it. This is a growing area from an operational standpoint. Even in transactional businesses, this is looked at a way to help speed that process at the tail end of a deal. So how can I quickly get information? What if there's a PO and they're kind of chipping away at the value of that PO? Can I connect those? Is another resource? Now, I'm going to focus in on the RFP, RFI side of this because that's the most common that we still see. But it's interesting to think about the operational pieces that come along with this from a standpoint of how do I help the sales organization really understand which deals we should be going after, how do I get those processed quickly, how can I make that deadline, and oh, by the way, how do I get them back out selling? So as we started to look at some of the elements within sales operations today from a pursuit perspective, one of the things is we didn't see a lot of competencies. So the understanding of deal structure, deal negotiation, how do we start to bring together a more formalized response doesn't really exist. So it's an area that sales operations leaders are saying, hey, I've got to improve upon this because 74% of them said, my involvement from a deal pursuit perspective is highly important. I recognize that as high strategic value that sales operations can bring to the sales organization. When does it really become valuable? Well, if you have a large percentage of your business that comes through RFPs, absolutely. And if you haven't thought about it, go spend a little time in understanding just how much activity time sales reps are spending creating, reading through, responding to RFPs. You will find a huge pocket of productivity advancement that you can build if you start to put operational support. The other side of it is complexity. So if you got a lot of complexity, maybe you have hundreds of products and there's a lot of SKUs, and depending on certain SKUs leads to other products and they have to all intertwine and configurations need to be created. This is where you can start to help from a pursuit perspective bring greater velocity to working with buyers. So there's three key things around deal pursuit I would ask you to think about as you kind of draw into this. The first is determine the need. So take a look at your business. And I'm not saying go back tomorrow and instantly turn on and say, hey, we're going to start helping with deals and we're going to negotiate. No. What's the need? Where is it? Right? Is it fully across the RFP process? Is it certain components? And then train the team. Right? You see that competency level. It just doesn't exist. Think about how you can start to increase that competency within your business and then define a process. Don't just leap into this. Make sure there's a defined process within it. Technology. I would assume if you're here, you're thinking about technology. But I want you to think about it from the standpoint of not just separate applications, but the broad stack. What is that sales application technology stack that has to exist in our business? And the way to be able to do that is, can I start to assess and understand what I have today, how well it's working together, and are there gaps? Are there things that I need to do differently? And when we think about what's going on, what we saw is, for the most part, there's this ever increasing population of sales operations that's getting involved with this. And when I talk about getting involved, it's not we're hiring programmers and people who can write code. We're talking about business ownership, a function that truly understands the need of the sales organization, because we want to think about our end user. Right? How can we take the tools that we're using and make sure it's extremely valuable for our end users? Look at that, 27% of sales operations leaders said, my function is highly competent. And we wonder why we continue to hear, hey, my Salesforce automation platform, I don't know, no one engages in it. Well, because we don't have the right competencies to really understand what the needs are and how to put them in place. Now, part of what we do as an organization is not only think about this from the standpoint of what's going on in the marketplace, but how do we help sales operations and other functions within B2B organizations be more successful? And that comes from different frameworks and models that we construct so that our clients don't kind of just go, gee, you're right, I got to do this better, but I don't know how. So in fact, one of the things that we actually have created within our service is looking at the technology alignment framework. So this is what helps organizations say, hey, wait a second, how do I make sure that my technology stack is aligned in a way in which bringing the greatest value into my business? So this helps them start to apply and say, what are the things I should be focused on? So giving them knowledge, right? Improving those competencies to be able to execute and have a valuable technology stack. So what I would say as you think about this is you got to identify what that right stack is. It's different for organizations. There's not one silver bullet, unfortunately. So you have to understand what are the needs, what are the key priorities I have, and how do I apply them, and learn how to measure value. And I want you to think about value in two lenses. The first, business value. So are the technologies we're using bringing business value? The second, end user value. How engaged and how valuable do my sales reps see this tool being? And then build a center of excellence. Put those key competencies into individuals who can really help design that stack and build it out. So project management. This is an area, many organizations may have a PMO, right? May be able to have resources they can tap into, but that's really good for when you have big, huge corporate-wide initiatives. But think about all the different initiatives that you put into your sales organization year after year to help drive growth. Sales operations has to be able to give some project management and project oversight into those. Those become projects that, if we go to a PMO, it's not feasible. As well as we may not have a resource in a PMO that knows enough about the sales organization to really guide it in the right way. Today, as we think about what's going on in sales operations functions, we don't see that there's a lot of competencies. So we saw about 36% of sales operations leaders said, I have high competence within my organization from a project management standpoint. And a little more than half of them said, hey, I'm regularly involved in kind of owning those initiatives and driving them from a project management standpoint. Well, if you're not really involved, do you really need the competence? Probably not if you looked at those two data points as standalones. But if we bring in a third point that says 74% of those sales operations leaders said that this is very to highly important. This is critical. There are so many initiatives going on within our sales organization that aren't getting completed, aren't being managed properly. We need to step up and play a strategic role. So that level of importance says, hey, we have to do something about this. We have to put focus into this. Project management certification. Whether that's something that you start to develop within your organization from an ad hoc perspective, or where I see clients, they're actually sending individuals out of their sales ops organization to become project management certified. It's becoming a critical competency to help manage all these different initiatives that are going on in their business. Look at the different project types that are going on. I'm not saying that sales operations starts to be a catch-all for every project that has any touch point to sales. Many times, it may be owned and managed in a different part of the business. And we might just be an influencer or a contributor to that. So identify what are those project types that are really important for us to focus on. And then the last piece is think about outsourcing in two ways. truly going outside the business, so being a project lead but bringing in some consultants to help, or looking at other resources that might exist in your organization. You might have pockets, especially in large global organizations, of resources that have both capabilities and capacity to be able to help with these projects. So how do we start to pull resources in to be able to execute faster? Can we identify those and map those out in our business? That's part of taking on that initial thought process of how can we manage projects better? So as we kind of think about these primary accountabilities, certainly mapping them out as seeing the 7 is helpful, but what we really saw was there's a lot of underlying components inside of that. And so what we've actually developed is what we call our sales operations sunburst. And what you see here in this model around that outside ring are those 7 accountabilities. And you see lots of cuts and slices within the wedges in between. And what exists in those and exists in the further research that we have and work with our clients on is how do you start to look at inner core accountabilities and outer core accountabilities? And how can you start to map those? So each of those wedges starts to become critical components. And what begins to happen is as you look at the maturity of your function, you start to understand, well, where am I? Where should my focus be? Where do I need strength? And we can start to light up which of those components come into play. And I wanted to put this up so you start to understand it's not just about throwing out research from a data perspective, it's about making it executable and actionable in your organization. So as you kind of leave the conversation today, there's a couple key takeaways that I'd like you to bring with you. The first is take time to assess the maturity of your function. Understand where you have strengths and where you have weaknesses. And also start to think about which of the accountabilities are most impactful to your business. My goal was not to say, go take those 7, put them up on a wall, and in the next 6 months you better figure out how to get all of them covered. That's not the goal. Understand which ones are most important for your organization and are going to bring the most value so you know where to put your focus. And start mapping out those key competencies that apply against those. What are the skills that I need? What are the knowledge points? What processes have to be in place? And think about how you're going to review those core competencies on an annual basis. As leaders, this is career progression. This is how we can build growth within our sales operations function if we can start to deliver new skills, new knowledge into the different people within our organization. So bring those competencies as a core part of the way you look at business. So over the last 40 minutes or so, we honed in on a key priority area that we see sales operations functions looking at, around functional design and development. What do I need to do? Unfortunately, in that amount of time, I know I can only do a certain amount of stuff. I wasn't able to kind of fix world hunger, create world peace, and honestly, I also just hit the tip of the iceberg on really advising you on key priorities, key focus areas for sales operations. Now, the good news is, it's what we do as a business. We spend time with individuals like yourself. We start to map out what those best practices are, help you understand what to measure. We've got the data and the research to really help you best understand that. We've got the frameworks and the models, and we've honed in on what those key priorities are for individuals like yourself.